So I will welcome Dawn Odell. Are you there? Can you hear me? I think she can hear. Yes, okay. She will...
Okay.
yeah, okay. Dawn Odell, she's a scholar and she is a professor at the Lewis and Clark College in Portland, in de Verenigde Staten. And she's working on the collection and the person of van Braam Houckgeest for many, many years already. Well, Dawn, I give you the floor because we are really excited to hear from you. Okay, maybe we can give a applause. Yeah, you can start, I think.
I should share my...
It's 5:30 in the morning for Dawn right now.
Okay, it's just loading. My name is Dawn Odell. I'm a professor of art history at Lewis and Clark College, which is in Portland, Oregon, on the west coast of the United States. I'm so pleased to be with you today. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm grateful for the technology that allows me to come to you virtually. And I'm also very pleased to be able to celebrate Nanette van Braam Houckgeest's book publication, which is so exciting to me. And I know that, so can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, very well, very well.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's loud enough.
Yes.
Okay. So I know Nanette will be telling you more about the life and especially the China mission of A.E. van Braam Houckgeest, who is pictured here. And as you will learn from her, van Braam traveled around the world and visited cities in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and of course, Europe. But the focus of my presentation is his time living in two US cities, in Charleston, which is in South Carolina, which is in South Carolina, and in Philadelphia, which is in Pennsylvania. As with many places van Braam lived during his life, both Charleston and Philadelphia are large, prosperous, cosmopolitan port cities, excellent places to make one's fortune, or as one historian has put it, early modern versions of the American dream. What I'd like to do is to look briefly at van Braam's time in these cities to give you some sense of the social worlds that he inhabited in each, and how these may have formed his ideas about how to acquire and display Chinese art. Oh, something's not working. Hold on. In Charleston, van Braam lived in this house, which was originally built for John Stuart in 1772. Before the American Revolution, Stuart had served as England's superintendent for Indian affairs. So van Braam purchased the house from Stuart. 2 rooms from this house were removed in the 1940s and given to the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where you can see them now. My son attends a college in Minneapolis, or in the area around there, and so he went and visited these rooms right before he came home for Thanksgiving. You may know that this weekend is our national holiday of Thanksgiving, so I've had 12 family members here celebrating. And it's also a time when we actually are thinking about the history of the United States, its relationship to the Netherlands and to the indigenous communities in the what's now the United States. And so all of this is sort of coming together in a lovely way for me to speak with you at a moment when my son is coming home from visiting this room. So this is one of these 2 rooms that are called period rooms. This is the other. And in addition to living in this house, van Braam also bought a rice plantation where he employed slave labor to plant and harvest the rice. When Van Braam lived in Charleston, the United States in the early period, their ideas about slave ownership were shifting from a model that emphasized the plantation as a kind of mini state in which the enslaved were seen as servants to the crown, to one that was more familial. And the enslaved in this case were seen as children of the master or of the father figure. This was also a period in which enslaved individuals who had been offered this tantalizing glimpse of freedom when the British were occupying Charleston were continuing to make last efforts to escape before the city was closed down when the United States troops took it over again. So the Charleston newspapers were full of offers for rewards for the return of runaway slaves, including at least 5, which were placed by Van Braam. I show the text of one of these on the screen, and I'll just read it to you. Runaway, from the subscriber, the 3rd instance. A Negro wench named Sylvia, formerly the property of Arthur Graham, late wagoneer conductor of the Southern. She is about 5 feet 8 inches high, of the Guinean country, and has the marks on both cheeks, also a deep hollow in the left one. She is of very dark complexion and had on when she went away a white woolen wrapper, green coat, and a check handkerchief round her head. As she has lately been seen a few miles out of town, it's supposed she will attempt to conceal herself in the country. Therefore, all persons are hereby cautioned of harboring or employing the said Negro, under the penalty of prosecution of the law directs. A reward of 3 guineas will be paid to whoever takes up and delivers the said wench to me at Trad Street. A.E. Van Braam Houckgeest. And I'm showing this then to again plant the idea of Van Braam occupying a position of a father figure in a plantation estate, which I think will later resonate when we talk about his estate of China's Retreat in Philadelphia. Charleston was also sadly the place where 4 of his youngest children died in a scarlet fever epidemic. It's heartbreaking to read the accounts of the deaths in the Charleston newspapers and to visit Charleston graveyards from this period, especially from the context of our own pandemic. Van Braam's family was not the only one to lose several children to the epidemic. 4 years after the deaths of his children, Van Braam and his wife and his youngest daughter, who was born after the death of her older siblings, returned to the Netherlands. But Van Braam's oldest daughter, Everarda, married a US Army captain and remained in the United States. So in a sense, she's founding the line of the US Van Braam Houckgeest. Although he probably could not have predicted it at the time, Van Braam, as far as I'm aware or have been able to discover, never saw his wife again after leaving her in the Netherlands. He returned then to China and to service in the Dutch East India Company. And again, you will learn much more about this period of time from Nanette, and especially about his contributions to the embassy to the Chinese court in Beijing. While he was in China, he commissioned this portrait of his wife, Katerina. We can date the painting in part because it's based on an engraving of a painting by Angelica Kaufmann. In the homosocial world of Canton, and by this I mean that because of Chinese prohibitions preventing women from living in these port cities along the east coast of China, it was an almost entirely homosocial world, both for the Chinese men who lived there as well as for the foreigner European men. So images like this one I see as part of a larger culture of longing, as the men missed their sweethearts and wives. Travel narratives, letters, poetry, and paintings like this all write about home, not as a nation state, but as a feminine domestic space. This painting was done in a technique known as reverse glass, in which artists traced the print through the glass sheet directly laid over it. But in order to render the finished painting in the correct orientation, the glass painter had to turn over the glass to fill in a now reversed composition, freehand from sight. So what I'm describing is technically a very difficult process. And in a sense, it becomes then a manual process for turning multiples, things like this engraved print, into singular images. So in some ways, the hand of the Chinese artist, even though we don't see it through really exaggerated brushwork, is there in terms of this layered and difficult technical process. In this painting, also of his wife, which was also commissioned while Van Braam was living in Canton, we can see that the model for his wife's face was probably also based on another representation, in this case, not a print, but a miniature painting, maybe a brooch or a medallion, similar to the Spencer work that I show on the left. And I should say that your own curator, Jan van Kampen, has written much more beautifully about the painting that we're looking at now. I'm just trying to give a couple of other examples of how we might see relationships between objects that exist outside of the painting and then their reproduction within the painting. So, for example, in the corner, this grisaille representation of a low relief architectural sculpture, which shows two women bidding farewell to a ship. Above the inscription, "Our good wishes accompany he who departs," is also similar to forms of jewelry that show women reclining on boxes and pointing to a departing ship which carries, we assume, a loved one. So this is a part of a whole suite of jewelry that in some cases incorporates direct ideas about mourning somebody who is actually deceased, but also mourning someone who's departed and may not return soon or ever. And another comparison then is with a Sepia Brooch. This was owned by Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, the man who would become the second president of the United States. Abigail received this brooch as a gift from her husband when he sailed to France with their 10-year-old son. So again, there's this potential for terrible loss. And here in this little brooch, you can see that charity and hope are symbolized by the anchor, which also alludes to safe passage, and the inscription in the brooch, "I yield, whatever is right." So again, succumbing to fate. And if we return then to Van Braam's painting as a whole, we can see that the female figure cradling the portrait of his wife sits upon an anchor and also signals hope. And then finally, just to mention that the glass on which these paintings were created was often mirrored. So when Van Braam would look into this image, he would see himself reflected on the mirrored surfaces, which are not perfectly silvered anymore, in the same way that you can see my face reflected taking a picture of myself in one of the reverse glass painted mirrors in the Rijksmuseum. So following the successful conclusion of his mission to Beijing, about which again you're going to hear more in just a moment, Van Braam returned to the United States, in this case, though not to South Carolina, but to Pennsylvania and to the city Philadelphia. He brought with him a famous set of porcelain dinnerware, which he gave to Martha Washington, who was the wife of the first president of the United States, George Washington. And he also brought an enormous collection of Chinese art, numbering in the hundreds of pieces. He published a memoir of the embassy, about which you'll hear more, both more about the memoir and the embassy. And again, you can see here that he dedicated it to George Washington. It was published in Philadelphia, printed in French. And the editor of the work was Médéric Louis-Élie Moreau de Saint-Marie, who was himself a very interesting individual, as peripatetic and well-traveled as Van Braam. He was born in Martinique. He returned to France to train as a lawyer. He practiced law in Paris, in Martinique, and in Haiti. And then fleeing the repercussions of the French Revolution in one of his returns back to France, he moved to Philadelphia and became a prominent member of the French émigré community in Philadelphia. He was also, I have to say, an ardent racist and an intense supporter of slavery. And in some ways, I feel this position infects Van Braam's memoir and the ways that he talks about art's ability to kind of reproduce a particular racist category. I'm just showing some details. You'll probably see more pictures of this, of the printed version of Van Braam's memoir. There's an enormous pull-out map showing a detail here. There are some interior illustrations of things like different forms of transportation, of members of the embassy visiting with Chinese officials, And just a detail here where you can see Van Braam in the second chair. During his time in Philadelphia, Van Braam also built an estate outside of the city in which to house his art collection. So life was lived in Philadelphia very similar to how life was lived in Charleston, in that the well-to-do or the up-and-coming would have both a residence in the city and then a residence outside of the city. So the residence outside of the city in Charleston was the rice plantation, and the one outside of the city in Philadelphia was China's Retreat, where he housed his collection of Chinese art. He moved to Philadelphia not only with this enormous collection of Chinese art, but also with his wife's niece, Johanna, who would eventually become his second wife, with a woman named Lana, who is described as Malaysian, with a boy named Kincius, who's also described as Malaysian or in some cases Eurasian, and with 5 unnamed Chinese men who acted as servants at the estate. As you can see, when we compare William Birch's depiction of China's Retreat with Drayton Hall on the right, which is a building in South Carolina that Van Braam knew and visited, much of China's Retreat architecture will seem to be conventional, although visitors did remark on the cupola, which is maybe more evident in this Birch watercolor. And I'm just showing a detail here. So again, I'm seeing the overall structure as being very typical of the kinds of architecture that one sees on plantations in the southern part of the United States. But the exception is this cupola, which was hung with silver bells and imitated the shape of a pagoda. I think overall, though, more important than any external appearance that signaled a kind of Chineseness was the house's interior, which, to quote Van Braam's editor, Moreau de Saint-Marie, and here I'm quoting him, "It was impossible to avoid fancying ourselves in China, while surrounded at once by living Chinese and by representations of their manners, their usages, their monuments, and their arts." Or to quote another visitor to Van Braam's home, "It was a sight of Asiatic luxury in the house of a man who was at once a Dutch baron and a Chinese mandarin." In Philadelphia, Van Braam encountered financial difficulties. He was incarcerated for debt in 1798. He actually took out an enormous newspaper advertisement to protest his innocence. But he was so offended by this trial and by the imprisonment that shortly after he moved to London with Johanna and sold his art collection at Christie's in 1799. You may know that the Christie's auction house was bombed during World War II, but they were very lucky to be able to preserve some of these older catalogs. Much was destroyed, but they were able to preserve these older catalogs. And the catalog of this sale is actually hand annotated, so we know how much each object or each set sold for. I should say, though, that many of the objects that Van Braam collected in China and brought to the United States remained in the United States with his eldest daughter. So that includes this bookcase, which is part of the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection and is inscribed or decorated with Van Braam's initials. Also this chair, which of course is at the Rijksmuseum, and fan, and lacquered toilet set. I'm just showing the mirrored portion of the set here and some of the interior containers. The Christie sales catalog, in addition to its handwritten annotations, also provides wonderful printed documentation of the objects that were sold. And one of the things that appears to have been lost, so there was one set of materials that was shipped, we think, with Van Braam for the sale, but there was another set of materials that was described as coming in this catalog, and that was seen to be even more exquisite and probably would have been the real showstoppers of the sale. But it's presumed that that ship was lost at sea and those objects never made it to auction. Among these is a surtout de table, which was described, and I'll just read it here, a tabletop made in China, according to Monsieur Van Braam, composed of 17 individual parts. It represents rocks, among which are pagodas, human figures, bridges, trees, fruits, flowers, quadrupeds, birds, insects, etc. Most of these objects are made of silver, variously colored and filigreed, while the flowers and fruits are of coral, amber, and other equally rare substances, or even precious stones. At the same time, picturesque, noble, and elegant are mixed ponds or streams where we see fish or crustaceans of a variety of species whose brilliance strikes the eye. And I'm just showing here an object that was sold, I think it's Sotheby's in this case, that maybe gives us some sense of what this enormous and wonderful show-stopping surtout de table might have looked like originally. So another version here. I mean, I'm not claiming this is at all the same object, but just maybe we see some of the same kind of filigree work and a detail. But what was considered to be the heart of the collection, and what visitors to China's retreat talked about as being the most impressive, were the drawings or paintings, the watercolors. And again, I'll read a quotation from the catalog. This invaluable collection of views in the several provinces of China were executed by an ingenious native artist who traveled for this express purpose through the interior of the empire, by the directions and at the expense of Mr. van Braam, who afterwards in his travels to Peking, upon the occasion of the embassy, and on his return, had frequent opportunities of witnessing the fidelity of the artist in representing many of these spots which lay upon his road. This naturally induced a belief in Mr. van Braam that an equal attention had been paid to truth with regard to the places which he had no opportunity of seeing. And what the catalog is drawing on here is the memoir in which Van Braam writes about, and I'm just providing my translation of the French. One can understand my joy in noticing that the drawing of Fujian, which I have in my collection, is of an extreme fidelity, since I can naturally conclude that the others have the same accuracy. So what's being described then as being the heart of the collection are these kinds of drawings, some of which reside in the Peabody Essex Museum, and then some of which reside in the British Museum. But there are problems, I think, with the catalogs and even Van Braam's celebration of the faithfulness of execution of these landscapes, because the paintings as a group, that is when we're comparing individual components within the larger group, do not seem to be factual or objective representations. And one comparison will have to stand in for all the others that I could have made to try to convince you of this point. So what I mean to say is that we're looking here at a landscape that's named as Meiling Jiaonan from the Peabody Essex collection. But we can compare it then with an example of perhaps a slightly different site for the British Museum collection. And you can see that they seem to be almost the same painting with some slight differences. And so what I'm suggesting then is that there were templates of a sort, and this is also an argument that Ki-il Choi has made, that there are templates or sort of fixed ideas in the minds of the artists that they're reworking over and over again. And not because these are objective, faithful representations of their experience of being out in a landscape, but instead they're representations of it, in a sense, other representations, which has a deep tradition in art making, and especially in landscape painting in China. And then we can see the ways that those images were used to become the templates for the printed illustrations in Van Braam's memoir. And just comparing that printed illustration to the Peabody Essex painting on the left. I think the last point then that I'd like to make about these wonderful watercolor paintings is that they are also drawing on, again, traditions that are not topographical, but that have to do with landscape as a site for representing an artist's engagement with art history, with the history of image making. And one way that we might see this is to look at Wang Hui's painting. This is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. We're just seeing a part of the hand scroll here. And this painting, we know from its inscriptions, is very clear that it's making reference to trying to emulate and imitate and show the artist's ability to transform through his own imagination other experiences of viewing paintings. And in terms of the particular kinds of odd brushwork that seem almost Cézanne-like to people who are steeped in a European tradition of image making, we can see that those same kinds of approaches to representing rocky faces of mountainous outcroppings is very similar in its kind of patterning of flat shapes against one another. I'm not suggesting then that the artists who painted the works for Van Braam have the same kind of virtuoso technique that we see in a painting like Wang Wei's. And it may be, in fact, that they weren't, these artists who produced these landscape paintings, weren't looking at other ink paintings, but that they were looking at painting manuals like the Mustard Seed Garden manual and drawing these kind of rocky forms from these printed manuals that circulated widely at the end of the Ming and early Qing dynasties. So all of this is to suggest that the context out of which these images arose is not the context into which they moved when they were displayed in Philadelphia. For again, to use a quotation from Moreau de Saint-Marie's introduction to Van Braam's memoir, and this is my translation, "Never, I dare to say, has a foreigner come out of China with such a treasure, with so many witnesses to his veracity." So he's talking here about the paintings as being personifications, as being witnesses to Van Braam's status as being a true traveler to China. And Monsieur Van Braam, if he did nothing but show the numerous drawings of all that this empire has presented him as suitable for figuring in his immense collection, China would be better known by that alone, by this collection of drawings alone, than by what we have known of it up to this moment. Finally, as if it were the destiny of Monsieur Van Braam to signal his stay in China by its most striking features, he brought several Chinese, here he's talking about the men, who seemed to have come to attest to the facts that this traveler took from there and entrusted in his collection of drawings, a collection he presented for several months in Philadelphia to all lovers of interesting things. Therefore, one believes oneself truly transported to China when one is surrounded by these living Chinese, the men, and these images of their customs, the drawings and paintings, their manners, their monuments, and their arts. So finally, and we'll just close with one of the other paintings from the collection, I want to conclude by saying that Van Braam's display of Chinese art occurred at an important point in US history in terms of the development of museums. China's retreat was bracketed by, on the one hand, Charles Wilson Peale's museum opening in Philadelphia in 1786. This is usually considered to be the first public museum in the United States. So that was 1786 in the same city where Van Braam also opened his museum of Chinese art. So there's the Peale Museum on the one hand, and then on the other side of Van Braam's China's Retreat is Nathan Dunn's Museum of 10,000 Chinese Things. Dunn was an ardent Quaker, an opponent of the use of opium, being enforced as a trade item by the British and the Americans. And so he created this 10,000 Chinese Things in part to present a positive view of China to audiences in the United States and in Great Britain. But Van Braam's museum was unique and unprecedented in the ways that it joined Chinese art to a domestic environment, one in which Van Braam himself became the father figure at the center of the exhibition, and the works of art, as well as the members of the household, Solana, Johanna, Kincius, and the 5 Chinese men, became witnesses to Van Braam's status as a China savant. Thank you so much. I wish I could see you all and could have looked you in the eyes as I was talking about this material, but I'm really grateful for the chance to share some perspectives from the United States on this wonderful collection of Chinese art. And again, congratulations on the publication of this great book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Don. Yeah, I cannot see you. We will Zoom later on to have a look. But there are about 100 people in the auditorium here at the Rijksmuseum, including Jan van Kampen. You just mentioned him. So maybe he has a question for you. I don't know. But maybe there are some others who has questions. And if not, do I see some? It was all clear. So, yeah, I've seen these albums myself in the Peabody Essex Museum and in the British Museum. They are really marvelous.
Yes,
And it's really nice. You must know that Dawn is writing a book.
yes,
Maybe you
yes.
can say something about that when it's...
Yeah, I am writing a book, especially about his collection of Chinese art in Philadelphia, trying to set it in the larger social, environmental, built and both natural environmental world of Philadelphia at that time. I do think his status as a plantation owner in the Carolinas is also important. So that's kind of I'm trying to set those two cities in the context of the other cosmopolitan port cities that he lived in, and especially Canton and also the Cape. So I'm getting close to almost being finished. Because I have children, the being shut in during the pandemic has slowed me down a little bit, but I hope it will be done soon.
Okay, you must know there are a lot of descendants of from Braam Houckgeest here this afternoon. So we are all curious and waiting for the book. Yeah. Okay.
It's such an honor to be speaking to you. You all know more about him than I do, for sure.
Okay, once more, thank you for being with us this afternoon. Maybe you go back to bed now, no? Or, yeah, I think so, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll see each other later. Yeah?
Very good. Thank you again so much.